you, and good to be with you. I hope that you can see my screen, and I'm sure someone will tell me if you cannot. I am grateful to the organisers for inviting me to speak, and I think this presentation will complement well the previous presentation from my distinguished panelists. So thank you for having me. So in this presentation, I would like to talk about the broader export control landscape as I see it. And I do feel that we're in a different era with regards to export controls. And I think that for a conference like this, it's important that we recognize the landscape and think through the recommendations for Asian countries, which was the theme of this session. So in this presentation, I'm going to touch on great power competition. I'm going to talk a little bit about the digitization of the economy. I will briefly touch on human security, and I will very briefly touch on emerging technology and military and use controls. But the point that I want to get to, and the focus of this presentation, will be quickly covering some background issues as I see them, so that I can come on to the recommendations that I would make to countries in Asia on navigating a more complex export control environment. So the great power competition issue has already been raised, and I don't necessarily want to overly focus on this. In other presentations that I've given, I kind of go through great power competition on a country-by-country basis, and I kind of draw out very specific points, and I sort of describe it as a multifaceted or multi-sided problem in which a number of states have specific concerns with other states, which drives action. And we heard already mentioned things like military-civil fusion, which is a specific concern in, say, the China context. But we also have to keep in mind that, and this is my broader point, the landscape that we're facing is one in which this is not to single out specific countries as such. What we see is a landscape in which a number of great powers have concerns with other great powers, which is driving the international security and international trade environment. So I will move on from great power competition, but I'd be happy to talk more about it in the discussion. Now, the next point I would briefly like to touch upon is tangentially related to great power competition, in that what I see is that in an era of great power competition, technology proliferation is happening through additional means. The digitization of the economy is one of these means, but actually I'm going to come on to talk about other means through which technology proliferation is happening at present. The digitization of the economy is a particularly important one, though, because what we see is that state-backed groups in several countries use the digitization of the economy as a pathway to indigenize, to steal and indigenize strategic technologies. And this poses a fundamental challenge to the effectiveness of export controls. And this is a particularly important issue in my mind because the export control systems and regimes that we have never really wrestled with the problem of securing digital information, including when it's at rest, when it's not being exported, but when it's stored by a company who holds dual-use technologies. So there's a particular a gap, I think, that we have in the export control system at present. If I quickly move on to my next slide with regards to human security. So this is another one of those slightly newer areas of strategic trade control, where particularly following the Arab Spring, there was a growing focus on human security concerns within the European Union, with the desire and with the goal of ensuring that materials and technology exported from the EU was not being used to repress populations in the context of the Arab Spring. However, this is another one of those topics that has been picked up and is becoming bound in to the great power competition issue. And I could mention specific cases in which this kind of has an instigating effect. But actually, what we see is that more countries now are working to build human security concerns into their export control system. For example, the US now also is accounting for human security in its export licensing process, which is a relatively new development. So this is one of those areas where I see more focus and more work being done to solidify a gap in controls, which is a new dynamic over and above the traditional multilateral export control regime focuses. And then we also have the emerging technologies issues, which have been touched upon. And I could give a longer presentation on the kind of dynamics around emerging technology controls. But in the interest of getting to my next slide on recommendations for countries in Asia, I think what I would say is that there are a whole plethora of technologies which are difficult to control through a standard list-based approach. And whilst work is being done to develop list-based controls for some of these, what we effectively see also is an increased realization that it is important to have military end-use controls to be able to stop transactions when it's going to a military end user of concern. And this certainly is one of the dynamics of great power competition, where with things like military civil fusion, we do see military-related entities, including, for example, military-related universities being used for technology acquisition. So the emerging technologies one is an important piece in general, but I would especially highlight to you the importance of military end-use controls. So if I was now to come on to my recommendations for countries in Asia, and I have a number of recommendations here, which I effectively offer to you as mitigations or approaches to manage risks in a great power competition environment. I don't kind of advocate for taking a specific line or viewpoint with regards to great power competition. My point is simply that it is important to have the tools in place so that the risks that go along with great power competition are at least understood and recognized without coming to a kind of definitive viewpoint on where one stands with regards to great power competition. So the first of these is what I perceive as a need for an all-tools approach. And what I mean by an all-tools approach is that there is a need to look beyond traditional export controls. And also, I need to look beyond the traditional export control regimes, even though they play a fundamental and important part of the export control system. And what do I mean by an all-tools approach? Well, what we have to do is to think about every mechanism by which technology transfer could occur. This includes intangible technology controls, which would be sort of within the confines of the traditional export control regime, perhaps, but also includes things like vetting schemes, which were mentioned, investment controls, sanctions, military end-use controls, and so on. And I come back also to the importance of having tools such as military end-use controls as part of one's arsenal, because I know from real-world experience and from talking to licensing authorities around the world that the military-induced controls are a particularly useful tool in mitigating risks and challenges in a great power competition environment when there are military end-use concerns. My next point is that there's a need to focus on cybersecurity standards. And as I said before, in my mind, this is a big gap at present because licensing authorities typically see transfers at the point of export and do not concern themselves with the standards which are in place around the technology when it's at rest, for example, on a company's premises. I do think that this is something that has to change. We have to grapple with how to securely store technology, whether it's being exported or whether it's being stored at home too. My next point is that it is, in my mind, important that countries develop guidance and what I'm calling risk mitigation strategies to navigate great power competition. And again, I don't advocate for taking a specific position with regards to great power competition, but I do think that it is important for every country to understand its exposure to potentially problematic trade and to take informed decisions about how best to manage those risks. So I think there's a need for guidance, and as part of the guidance, I would say that there is a need to develop due diligence and red flag examples to share with industry, for example, which are specific to great power competition as opposed to the more traditional export control and WMD threats. And finally, and I've talked about this already, so I can be brief, there's a need to consider the human security aspect of this and how best to manage that in the context of control. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.